They built an empire by burying me beneath it until I learned to code its collapse. My name is Vanessa Powell, and at 38, I should have been celebrating the pinnacle of my success. As the founder and CEO of Nexus Technologies, a rising star in the world of AI-driven supply chain software, I had built my company from the cracked concrete of doubt and familial dismissal to the polished marble of international recognition. So why was I standing at the edge of a garden wedding, in designer heels, feeling like an unwanted guest in a life I had helped reshape? Let me take you back to Westfield, Connecticut, where my story and the seeds of this betrayal were first planted. My brother Scott and I were born 2 years apart, but back then we might as well have been twins. We shared secrets under bed sheets with flashlights and tried to fly by jumping from the shed roof with pillowcases tied to our backs. In those early years, we were inseparable. Our parents, Judith and Robert Powell, were as classic a New England couple as you could find. My father, a self-made man who expanded his father's construction company into a regional player. My mother, ever polished, ran the household like a corporate enterprise. Elegant dinner parties, perfect holiday cards, rehearsed smiles, but even then the invisible cracks were forming. When Scott joined the football team, my father's eyes lit up like a man who saw his own reflection in a trophy case. I, on the other hand, was drawn to code. I stayed after school for robotics club and weekends for science fairs. I still remember coming in second at the State Tech Expo with a 3D printed prosthetic prototype. I waited for them in the crowd. They never came. Business and sports build character, my father said once as he ruffled Scott's hair after a game. All that computer stuff is a phase. You'll grow out of it. Spoiler alert, I didn't. One winter afternoon, I sat alone on the porch steps after school, a participation medal dangling from my fingers, cold and unwanted. Scott came home with a muddy jersey and a black eye. My father whooped and threw an arm around his shoulder, praising him for toughness. I had won a regional coding challenge the day before. No one mentioned it. That was the first time I realized love in our house had conditions. At MIT, I learned more than code. I learned resilience, independence. I graduated with honors and landed a job in Boston, working 80-hour weeks at a startup where the coffee was terrible, but the code was golden. Meanwhile, Scott stumbled his way through a business degree, landed at Powell Construction, the family business on the golden escalator of nepotism. Within months, he was managing regional projects he barely understood. When I asked my mother why Scott had it so easy, she smiled thinly and said, "Scott understands people, Vanessa. You understand machines." That sentence haunted me for years. By 28, I'd had enough. I used my savings and a line of credit to launch Nexus Technologies from my tiny apartment. My desk was a repurposed IKEA table, my bed a fold-out couch. I ate instant noodles so often that I began dreaming of MSG. I coded through fevers, pitched through migraines, and taught myself sales in between debugging AI algorithms. One night, I fainted at my desk and woke up on the floor, laptop still, humming. That's how close I had lived to the edge, and yet, I never felt more alive. Back home? My parents continued to treat me like I was experimenting with a hobby, until the day I signed a $30 million contract with Bradford Enterprises, the largest in Nexus's history. Enter Tiffany Bradford. Beautiful, blonde, and brilliant at being. Admired. The daughter of Richard Bradford, CEO of a multi-billion-dollar real estate empire. She and Scott met at a charity golf tournament. She was everything Scott wasn't. Strategic, polished, and effortlessly social. 6 months later, they were engaged. The Powells had never been prouder. My mother, for the first time in years, sounded giddy on the phone. Richard just loves Scott. He says he's got the kind of leadership you don't teach in schools. The irony was pungent. Around the same time, I was contacted by Eleanor Wright, Bradford Enterprises Director of Operations. They needed next-gen software for logistics and were blown away by our live demo at a tech summit. 3 months later, we signed. That night, I called my parents. "We just closed a $30 million deal with Bradford Enterprises," I said, holding back tears of exhaustion and pride. "That's nice, dear," my mother replied. "Did you get the invite to Scott and Tiffany's engagement party?" Just like that. Dismissed. The engagement party at the Bradford estate was opulent, to the point of absurdity. As I stepped out of my Tesla, Marcus, my boyfriend and a venture capitalist, whistled under his breath. They weren't kidding about old money, he said. The mansion was all Georgian columns and manicured perfection. Guests wore pastels as though auditioning for a Ralph Lauren ad. My navy blue dress felt suddenly rebellious. Inside, champagne flowed and whispered conversations hummed over harp music. I spotted half the state legislature and more than a few CEOs. No one looked twice at me. I met Richard Bradford near the garden fountain. "You're the brilliant mind behind Nexus," he said with a firm handshake. "Eleanor says your software is already changing our cost structure. I'd love to hear your vision over dinner sometime." For a moment, I felt seen, respected. Then my mother appeared. "You two have met?" she asked, feigning surprise. "She's your daughter?" Richard's brow lifted. Scott never mentioned his sister ran Nexus Technologies. That silence, it wasn't awkward. It was revealing. My mother's laugh was brittle. "Vanessa's always been our little computer genius." Richard's polite smile faded. A remarkable coincidence. But it wasn't a coincidence. It was deliberate. My brother had erased me from the narrative. He wanted to be the business genius, the rising star. And I was inconvenient. Later, as I stepped away to catch my breath, near the side terrace I found Tiffany. "You're Vanessa, right?" she asked, sipping from a crystal flute. "Scott's sister?" I nodded, wary. "You built Nexus. That's impressive." "Thanks." She tilted her head. "You know, I suggested your software to Eleanor after seeing your panel at the summit. I didn't realize you and Scott were related until later," I blinked. "You did?" She smiled. Scott didn't seem thrilled when I mentioned it. Still, I held on to hope. Maybe the wedding would change things. I chose my dress carefully, brought Marcus. I was ready to be visible. But the moment I arrived at the wedding, I knew I was a ghost in my own family. My name wasn't on the main seating chart. I found a planner. "Hi, Vanessa Powell, the bride's sister-in-law?" He glanced at his tablet. "Yes, table 17, over by the pool deck." The pool deck was for the overflow, the business partners' assistants, plus ones of forgotten cousins. My name, my status, was nowhere near the head table where my software was the reason Bradford's quarterly profits were up. I was seated behind a potted fern, directly beside the speakers blaring Bruno Mars. Across the lawn, I saw Scott raising a toast, smiling as Tiffany clutched his arm. My parents beamed, champagne in hand. No one looked for me. No one noticed. Marcus touched my hand. "Want to leave?" "No," I said. "Not yet." Because sometimes you need to see the full picture. The disrespect, the lies, the small, silent cruelties, to understand the scale of the revenge that's coming. And I promise you, this story doesn't end with a toast and a dance. It ends with a reckoning. They say revenge is best served cold. I preferred it calculated, coded, and catastrophic. In the weeks after Scott and Tiffany's wedding, I didn't allow myself to rage. Rage was wasteful. Instead, I studied patterns, players, weak points. My own family had drawn the blueprint. I would simply follow it in reverse. I began with Tiffany. Not out of pettiness, but precision. She was sharp, sharper than Scott, sharper than Judith ever gave her credit for. And as I'd learned, she was the reason Bradford Enterprises had ever considered Nexus Technologies. She saw value before anyone else did. So I sent her flowers, not anonymously, directly. White orchids with a handwritten card. For the woman who saw Nexus before the world did. Let's build something extraordinary. Together. Vanessa Powell. 3 days later, her assistant emailed to schedule lunch. We met at a quiet French bistro near the financial district. She wore silk. I wore war paint beneath a navy blazer. Tiffany wasted no time. "Scott has no idea we're meeting." "Neither do my parents," I replied. "Let's keep it that way." Over duck confit and chilled chablis, we laid it out. She wasn't happy with how the family dismissed me. She wasn't thrilled that Scott had claimed credit for the Nexus Bradford deal. And she certainly wasn't planning on being another decorative spouse sipping Chardonnay while her in-laws whispered business behind mahogany doors. "I married him because I love him," she said, "but I won't shrink for him." "Then let's make sure you grow." Loudly. The next move? Leverage. Scott was careless with email. Years ago, he'd looped me in on a Powell construction server migration, assuming I'd be his free IT consultant. I still had credentials to a staging server that mirrored their live database. I logged in at midnight. Their cybersecurity was laughable. Within an hour, I had access to expense accounts padded with luxury hotels and golf trips, vendor kickbacks funneled through shell subcontractors, altered environmental impact assessments on a coastal development in Rhode Island, and emails, so many emails. One from Scott to a project manager. Just white label the report. No need to raise flags unless the inspectors start sniffing. And another. Bradford wants that deal inked. If we need to grease a local council, make it happen. I copied everything to an encrypted drive. I wasn't going to leak it. Not yet. My next meeting was with Eleanor Wright, the director of operations at Bradford Enterprises. Tiffany set it up. "We're reviewing Nexus's long-term integration," Eleanor said as we sat down. "The last quarter's performance has been impressive." "We've been developing a proprietary procurement AI," I told her. "It learns supply chain behavior across vendors, optimizes for compliance, cost, and ethics. It flags risks, like fraud." Eleanor raised an eyebrow. "Including partners like Powell Construction?" I smiled. "Especially them." I offered a demo. It ran simulations with redacted Powell data. By the end, Eleanor's brow was furrowed. "If that data's real, this could be explosive. I want a pilot program. Confidential. You pick the region. Let Nexus show you what your partners aren't." 3 weeks later, we launched in 3 cities. 6 weeks in, Powell Construction's Rhode Island project was flagged. At the next Bradford Enterprises quarterly meeting, Richard Bradford looked unusually tense. Eleanor presented a compliance report with neutral language but damning implications. My name wasn't mentioned, neither was Scott's, but everyone in the room knew. That evening, my mother called, for the first time in years. "Vanessa, have you been talking to Tiffany?" "Why do you ask?" "Because there's an audit hitting Scott's office. Environmental regulators. Vendor invoices being questioned. You wouldn't..." "Mother, if Powell Construction has nothing to hide, they'll be fine. You're playing with fire." I hung up. 2 months later, Bradford Enterprises formally suspended its Rhode Island deal. They cited compliance concerns and promised full cooperation with authorities. Scott was livid. He cornered me at a charity gala. "You think this makes you look strong? You're ruining your family. You did that when you erased me from my own story. You're just bitter. I'm strategic," he spat. "Dad's gonna cut you out." "Already did. But here's the thing, Scott. Your company depends on a software platform you didn't even bother to credit. You're living on my infrastructure." He stared. I smiled. 3 weeks after that gala, Tiffany made headlines. Tiffany Bradford Powell, appointed Chief Strategy Officer at Bradford Enterprises. She orchestrated it brilliantly, gaining board support, leveraging her contacts, and quietly realigning the company's vision. In her first address, she emphasized transparency, digital modernization, and partnering with innovators like Nexus Technologies. My photo was included in the press release. At Thanksgiving, I didn't go home. Judith sent a card, no signature, but Tiffany sent a gift. A limited edition Montblanc pen with a note. "You wrote the code. Now write the future." I uncorked a bottle of Bordeaux, curled up with Marcus, and watched the news as Powell Construction announced a full internal audit. Sometimes it's about redefinition. I didn't burn the house down. I rewired the foundation. And now, I stand not behind the potted fern, but at the helm of a new empire. Stay tuned. This was just the blueprint for payback. It's one thing to reclaim a name. It's another to reshape the legacy that name was supposed to represent. Bradford Enterprises' new era had begun, and I was no longer whispering at its edges. I was architecting its core, but true power isn't in headlines or titles. It's in what people fear you might do next, and they feared me. With Tiffany as CSO, the tides were shifting fast. She brought in external auditors under the guise of modernization, but every department head knew the truth. This was a purge. Old contracts were shredded. Vendor relationships dissolved overnight. Anyone who'd played fast and loose with regulations started scheduling emergency vacations. Scott tried to hold ground. He called in favors, leaned on allies. But Tiffany had anticipated every move. I helped her map out a strategy months earlier. A week after her appointment, I received an email. Subject: formal collaboration invitation. Nexus and Bradford Vanessa. As discussed, Bradford Enterprises would like to formally retain Nexus Technologies as our strategic innovation partner. Let's lead this transformation together. Tiffany. The new contract was worth 8 figures, and it came with equity. I made a note to thank Scott. After all, none of this would have been possible without his betrayal. My mother didn't call again. She showed up at my office in pearls and panic. "You've made your point," she said, ignoring Marcus, who sat across from me reviewing AI data models. "Actually," I replied, "I've only made the opening argument. We're still your family. You disowned me. Publicly. Repeatedly." She glanced around the Nexus headquarters. Glass, light, humming innovation. I didn't know it would go this far. Didn't know I would rise? Or didn't care? She faltered. "Judith," I said finally, "if you want me to pull punches, you'll have to explain why you landed so many first." In January, Bradford's annual leadership summit convened at a private resort in Aspen. Scott showed up with a forced smile and a hidden agenda. He'd spent weeks lobbying to get Tiffany removed, claimed she was too disruptive, too ambitious, too loyal to outsiders, meaning me. But Tiffany and I were ready. She presented a 5-year vision: AI-integrated compliance, net zero construction. Strategic acquisitions, starting with an eco-construction startup, Nexus, had quietly funded. I followed with a technical roadmap that made even the oldest board members sit up straight. Real-time site analytics, predictive risk modeling, blockchain-backed vendor chains. Then Tiffany dropped the final slide. Internal risk assessment, Powell construction. Not the sanitized version. Scott expected the full report. Shell companies, kickbacks, regulatory red flags, silence. Then Richard Bradford leaned forward. "Scott, we'll need your resignation by Monday." Scott didn't go quietly. He blamed Tiffany, me, the AI, the auditors, even the interns. He threatened legal action. We reminded him of the NDAs he signed and the criminal liability he'd face if anything came to light. 2 weeks later, he fled to Dubai. Judith held a press conference announcing a family sabbatical. Bradford's stock dipped briefly, then surged as investors realized the Powell era was finally over. Meanwhile, I celebrated with mint tea and a data deployment that mapped risk across every remaining Powell project. I didn't just want revenge. I wanted resurrection. We launched a joint venture, Bradford Nexus Future Build. It focused on sustainable, tech-driven infrastructure. We landed our first international contract within 3 months, rebuilding flood-resistant housing in Bangladesh using modular AI-optimized blueprints. Tiffany spearheaded the expansion into renewable energy. I built a predictive model for geopolitical construction risk. Together, we attracted talent from Silicon Valley, Geneva, and Nairobi. I hired engineers who'd been laughed out of boardrooms. Women, queer people, immigrants, people like me, and I paid them well. One morning, as cherry blossoms bloomed outside the Nexus campus, I received a letter, handwritten, no return address. "Vanessa, you were always more than they allowed you to be. I see that now. I'm sorry." "Dad?" It wasn't signed with his name. I tore it in half but didn't throw it away. The United Nations invited me to speak at their Global Urban Development Forum in Geneva. My talk? Infrastructure intelligence, rebuilding trust. Through technology. As I stood backstage, I thought of the girl behind the potted fern, her silence, her shame, her steel. I walked to the podium. "Legacy isn't what you inherit," I began. "It's what you architect from the ashes." Later that year, we released Nexus Monarch, a platform that lets cities model infrastructure needs, equity outcomes, and climate resilience in real time. Tiffany. And I co-authored a white paper. Judith sent an email. 2 sentences. Read it. Impressive work. Hope you're well. I didn't reply. I didn't need to. I'd already rewritten the story. Not as a Powell, not as a victim, but as the final architect of a new empire rooted in vision, vengeance, and an unshakable code.